Hi, everyone. This is 5 tips for accessible documentation. And I'm Alexandra, based in New York City, as you all know. Let's not talk about that at all. All the US-based people who are here, which there's more than just me, that's great. Let's all just forget for now. Um, and I'm an accessibility advocate and a big fan of Swedish pastry. There is a bakery called Fabrik, which is also in Stockholm, I believe, and it's right near my office, which I miss tremendously. On the agenda today, I'm going to remind you why accessibility is important and why we as writers need to care. I'm going to give you 5 practical, actionable ways to make changes to your documentation, and then I'll leave you with some final thoughts and time for questions. Quick note, in case you haven't seen this acronym before, it's around in the accessibility space. A11Y stands for accessibility because there are 11 letters between A and Y. And it's important to me to say this because I didn't know that. I was in the space and kept seeing it and just thought, oh, that's a cute way to think about accessibility. We're allies. It's more than that. So why does accessibility matter? Why are writers specifically responsible for accessibility? And why is it not just the engineers and designers? If you were at the Write the Docs Portland talk this year, or if you watched the video, then you will be familiar with these statistics. 4.13 billion people on Earth use the internet, and 28% of them, or a billion users, have some form of visual impairment. That means anything from needing to wear glasses to read, or being colorblind, or having an astigmatism, or a person who is blind. 19%, or about 78 million people, have a cognitive disability, and that includes intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities. And those are just 2 examples of 2 types of disabilities that may affect the way folks use the internet. There are folks with auditory, speech, and other neurological disabilities. It's pretty much guaranteed that some part of your audience who you're writing for has a disability. And ultimately, I believe that what is often lost in conversations about accessibility is content. We are responsible for making our content accessible, just like the designers and engineers are responsible for our product's UI. Part of that is content design, and part of that is language. So tip 1, use inclusive language. Inclusive language avoids biases, slang, or expressions that discriminate against any group of people based on race, gender, or socioeconomic status. It also avoids language that is ableist or discriminatory against disabled people. Inclusive language allows you to resonate more with audiences by speaking and writing in more impartial ways. First, a note on cultural differences. I think there are often words for folks who speak English as a second, third, fourth, fifth language. I really wish I spoke more than one language, well, anyway, that you may be surprised to hear are offensive, particularly in American culture, which I can only speak from that experience because I have only lived in the United States. But it may be different where you are, be it in Sweden or anywhere else around the world. It is important to do the work whenever you're visiting another country in real life or virtually to educate yourself on those words in advance and accept critical feedback. I've definitely made mistakes when I've gone places. We all do. But as far as word choice for disabilities, I feel pretty comfortable that my guidance will be cross-cultural. For example, in the cognitive impairment category, or in any category, it would be okay to say a person is disabled or a person has a specific diagnosed condition, such as saying a person with Down syndrome. assuming that they are actually diagnosed as such. Language to avoid may sound awkward at best, or at worst be offensive. For example, it's never okay to call someone slow or insane. If you use those words in everyday conversations, even in jest, I encourage you to remove it from your vocabulary. Using phrases like person with a disability emphasizes the person and not his or her condition. This is encouraged by a lot of institutions, including at Google. That's the way we think about a lot of our disability language. But person-first language isn't the only way to be inclusive. Disabled people sometimes choose identity-first language, which claims and celebrates rather than distances themselves from their disabilities. Someone who prefers person-first language may identify as a person with an amputation. Someone who prefers identity-first language may identify as an amputee. This is an individual choice, so if you're talking to or about a specific person, I encourage you to ask them directly how they would like to identify. And ultimately, a lot of this may not be the specific challenges that you face day to day in technical writing and in writing documentation, but it's really essential in empathy building and committing to do better for those with disabilities, both in our job and in our everyday life. And when it comes to technical language, there are a number of ways in which we can be inclusive. This includes removing ableist language as well as racist terminology and gendered language. For example, use primary and replica instead of master and slave. This might be a complicated change to make immediately, especially if it's written into a code base and you're writing about that code base. And people may resist. People may say, this is how it's always done. This has technical meaning. It's not about racism. Why are you so concerned? But we have the power to make change. We have the power to make things better. Those words historically have a power dynamics, which we can do something about, and we can remove it from our language. Use allow list and block list instead of white list and black list. Use singular they pronouns instead of gendered neutrals like he or she. And that, I know, can be particularly complicated in languages other than English, and I'm curious to hear how other companies resolve this, especially when writing documentation in languages where pronouns are more complicated. Finally, another example, use the word placeholder instead of dummy. Dummy is definitely ableist language, and there are a lot of better words to use. There are some words that you may hear you should avoid. Not everything has a hard and fast rule of this is good and this is bad, but use your best wisdom, and there are a lot of lists out there of practical, inclusive language. Tip 2. Relying only on visual cues to communicate important information excludes anyone who is colorblind or visually impaired. For example, avoid exclusively using visual elements to convey information, including colors, patterns, images, and font styling. Always use text or alternative text along with any visual elements. In physical spaces, this might look different. For example, in this picture, I see buttons that are green and red, which I understand to mean start and stop. But there are problems with this. First, I understand those colors' meanings because I'm a global Westerner, and traditionally that's what green and red imply. It may not be the same in other parts of the world. But someone who has that understanding might be colorblind and unable to see which button is which, and that makes this far more complicated. Avoid directional language. For example, in my documentation for Google Ad Manager, the way to contact us can be found in our user interface, and it's visually in the top right corner. But that information isn't particularly helpful for anybody who's using a screen reader. Consider saying, click Contact Us in the site menu, and that accurately names the link, making it easier to find. Tip 3, write clear headers. Informative, unique page titles and headings throughout a document are really critical to a document's organization. And your header content should be short, high-level summaries of what readers can expect in a section. Readers should be able to understand what those headers mean without needing extra context. And those headers should be front-loaded with action-oriented language. For example, get started with this feature, or store your data on a server, with instructions that follow that make sense with those headers. Just as important as content, though, is the way your content is structured. Visually, headers help us and our eyes navigate around a page, and this is especially helpful for people with cognitive disabilities. David mentioned in his talk the importance of semantic documentation, and that's essential for accessibility too. Using the correct HTML helps screen readers understand the importance of different types of content. Therefore, screen reader users can better navigate a page. Specifically, headings, for example, are ranked H1 through H6, may even go beyond that, though in most of your writing, I can't imagine using H12. H1 should represent the most important idea on the page, aka the page title, with sections organized with H2 level headings. Sections can then be subdivided with H3 level headings, so on and so forth. And you might not actually be writing in HTML. I use a visual editor in most of my work. Occasionally I write in Markdown, which looks like this. But however you're creating your content, if it appears online and not in print, make sure that the HTML you create is actually headers and doesn't just look like headers. I see that mistake in Google Docs all of the time. People make the font really big to pretend it's a header without actually using the header element. And that's, again, not helpful for screen readers. The screen reader doesn't see that font is really big, but the screen reader can see the semantic HTML. Tip 4, write meaningful link text. Imagine you're in a shopping mall and all of the store signs say store. How do you know what store you're in? You have to look for other clues. Meaningful link text is so important for a product interface and documentation. Link text acts as signposts which guide people throughout a product or a website. Links might take a user to another part of the product, another document, or a different site altogether. And it's important to provide unique and meaningful labels for link text so that users and screen readers can confidently take action. Click here is very overused and a way of yelling at your reader, did you know this is a link? Click the link, click. But it's not actually telling the reader where they'll be going and what they're going to learn. So let's get rid of click here and learn more and put our links in context. For example, the following sentence has 2 links. Write the Docs has conferences on 3 continents. Keep up with the community on the Slack channel. The first link, conferences on 3 continents, I can be confident that it will take me to a conference page to learn more about the 3 different conferences. The second link is on Slack channel, and I assume, again, that it's going to take me directly to the Write the Docs Slack channel. Alternatively, you could make keep up with the community a link rather than Slack channel because it's telling the audience what they're going to be doing when they click on the link, that they'll be keeping up with the Write the Docs community. And tip 5, use thoughtful alt text. Alt text or alternative text for images, or often called alt tags, is text read by screen readers for folks who have visual impairments. And alt text is really useful also when images aren't properly rendered in the UI or on your documentation. Some general best practices: be contextual, use description, be clear, but be careful in your wording. Be concise. You don't need to start your alt text with the image of. Start with whatever the description of the image is. Write in plain English. Don't use jargon, acronyms, or past tense, just like you would in your documentation. And if your site is using keywords, use them sparingly. Just something to note too, not all images actually require alt text, only those that have meaningful context within a workflow on a site. So if there's a little icon because it makes the documentation look happier, don't add alt text if it's not actually helpful to the user accomplishing their goals. Some bad examples of alt text. There's a picture and the caption is breakfast. What kind of breakfast? Tell me more. Much longer alt text. This alt text says, a photo of a white plate with 2 blackberries, 3 blueberries, and 2 strawberry slices, and whipped cream with mint on top on one corner of a Belgian waffle. There is also a side of syrup. Quite verbose, quite a lot of words, and frankly, it's unnecessary. In particular, the a photo of. By virtue of being alt text, it will be a photo, it could be a drawing, but it's an unnecessary part of the description. Much better alt text would be a waffle on a plate topped with whipped cream, mint, and berries with a side of syrup. It's brief. Folks know what they're looking at or reading and can visualize. It doesn't need to be exactly descriptive of every single detail to get the point across. And despite the fact I just gave you 5 specific items to make your documentation more inclusive and more accessible, I do want to emphasize that accessibility isn't actually a checklist. Accessibility is something that we need to integrate into every part of our writing process and ultimately to care about in our life. We need to support others around us to make our docs and our products as accessible as possible. Part of that is working to create a culture of accessibility. In an ideal world, this comes from the top down. We rely on managers and leadership to set the tone of the type of work that we create. But speak out, be an advocate, talk to your manager, use whatever influence you have on your team to make an accessibility difference. Your goal is not to be an expert. Even though I'm here talking about accessibility, I am not an expert. I am still learning constantly more and more about how to be a better advocate. Your goal is to also continue learning and to make things better as you continue to learn. And at Google, every decision we make comes with data. I make a change to increase or decrease the percentage of something. Prove why accessibility is worth your time and worth your colleagues' time. And by doing that, you may be able to provide evidence of future financial gain. Ultimately, if you live in a capitalist society, saying, you'll make more money is very good evidence as to why someone should care about accessibility or anything at all. Enlist the help of experts. If there are folks at your company who know a lot about accessibility or work on it, talk to them, set up a virtual coffee date or in person if you can do so, and learn about the work they do and make those connections to, again, continue to learn more and better your work. And find resources. There are a ton of articles and books and existing talks and conferences that are related to accessibility. even if not directly related to technical writing, there's still valuable information about accessibility. And I'm happy to help you start your resources journey. There are so many different items out there on the internet for you to peruse freely. There are conferences in the European Union. There are more talks to watch from previous Write the Docs conferences, specifically in Prague in 2018. What a grand time. I really encourage you to read as much as you can and commit to making small changes. Don't try and do everything at once. It's okay to take your time and to say, today my goal is to make sure that all of the headings in my documentation are semantic and make sense. One thing at a time. Thank you so much for listening. And if you need more resources, I have collected some on GitHub. I'm still actively adding more. Please share what you found. Let's make it better together.
Yes, we have a few questions, and I can start just so I know how to pronounce correctly. Is ALI actually an acceptable pronunciation for this acronym or numeronym? Is it acceptable?
I think yes. I've heard my boss calls it ALI. I always read it as ally because it's an acronym. I don't know that it matters.
So I actually tried Googling now because one of the questions, and it says that it shouldn't be, like it's wrong to say ALI because it's letters and not words, and that it should be pronounced as A11Y or A11Y. So I was just curious. For the purpose of brevity, I will use ALI after all. So the questions that came up on Slack, how do you see cognitive bias and inclusiveness/accessibility?
How do I see it? That's a good question. I think in particular, a bias that I have as a person who I don't have a learning disability, so it's hard to keep those things top of mind. The one that comes to mind at this moment is dyslexia and the moving letters around and not being able to read as quickly. That remembering that disability exists and even making your font larger. Something I talked about in my Write the Docs Portland talk was this company called Ravelry, which had a lot of accessibility problems on their website. And part of it was the font not having enough white space between, or the line space in paragraphs was off, and it made it difficult for folks with certain cognitive disabilities to read the text. Can we as tech writers make that change? Sometimes. Sometimes if we see it, it's our job to go advocate to our designers and engineers to make that change.
Okay, next question is both for Alexandra and David. Does using markdown affect screen readers retrieving content?
My understanding of it depends on what site generator you're using. For the most part, site generators will take that markdown and make it into HTML. So a user is not going to see the hashtag or £. They'll see the proper heading tags. Markdown doesn't have every single form of semantic HTML. Ultimately, it may be better if you have the knowledge to use it, but we use the tools that we are given to create documentation. So as long as you're using it properly, it shouldn't be a problem.
I'll add that generally speaking should be a problem, yes. And Markdown, for example, you should be able to add alt texts to links and or link text and alt text images and stuff like that. So that should be supported depending on the flavor probably you're using. But generally it should be all good.
Okay, we have more questions. Do you have any recommendations for how to test your content for ALI issues?
That is a great question. There are some existing tools out there that measure color blindness and affecting the visual elements of your documentation. There are a lot of tools out there. There are some grammar tools, such as Grammarly. I think that's the one I'm most familiar with that will check for sentence structure issues. But a lot of things you can't, there isn't a tool yet to make those tests. It's something that I'm advocating for in our own internal content tools to try and put up a flag if alt text is missing, which, as I said in the talk, you don't always need alt text, but to raise awareness of, hey, you might have missed this. Some of this work will be manual, but there are linters, I think, to get rid of words that are not inclusive. There are a lot of linters out there to flag different words.
Okay, next question. Currently, there is perhaps a lack of diversity in research or design teams in companies. Have you faced any of those, and how do you promote that at the first place?
Oh, yes. The number one thing, I think the number one barrier to accessibility work and inclusion work is that folks who are a member of those groups aren't able to advocate for themselves because they're not in the room, because they're not on the design teams or work teams. And the way to advocate for that is partly talking with managers, talking to people who make hiring decisions. I am not a person who makes hiring decisions. I have no power. But being a part of different groups, there are a lot of ways that you can be an ally without being a member of a group. It's easier in a giant company like I'm at than it is at a much smaller company, but asking questions, I think, is a good way to start. And being a part of digital communities too, trying to get more diverse faces in the room is the best way to fix the problem, which you may or may not have power over.
Okay, more questions. I noticed Google Help usually contains few screenshots. Is it part of accessibility decision?
100% yes. Partly because it's difficult to maintain them. If once you take a screenshot, if the UI changes, every time it changes, you should update the screenshot. When I started, there were videos from my product that were 4 years old that really explained how it worked well, but the UI looked totally different. And that's really confusing. So that's the reason, to remove confusion. But also, sometimes a screenshot can be duplicative of the content. It's a tough balance.
Next question. I recently listened to a seminar with ALI experts who were quite clear that links as part of body text can be problematic, mainly for persons with difficulties reading, I guess. They suggested, for instance, putting the links in a bullet list close to the text. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I can definitely understand, especially if it's a large paragraph with 3 or 4 links, that I can see why that would be problematic. And I think that having a bulleted list of resources is a great way to resolve that problem. I think that there are a lot of ways in which I think about and work on accessibility fixes, but they don't work universally. We can't solve all problems. So it's just listening to your users is the number one way to be better. Asking questions. Hey, are you having a problem reading this? Why? How can we make changes? And making changes based on your users' needs.
And last question, for now at least. You mentioned Grammarly. Do you have any privacy concerns around using Grammarly when writing technical documentation, in the sense that apparently they share content with third parties?
Yeah, I don't use it. It is the tool that I'm most aware of. For the most part, I use the spell check that is built into Google Docs and Microsoft products. It's a shame. It's a shame. There are definitely privacy concerns. I can't advocate for it for that reason. I hope folks are working on better solutions that don't involve sharing your data with third-party companies.
And one more question, how to get hold of the links from the presentation?
Yes, so the best way, a lot of these links are at this link, which is on the screen, alexand.us/tw-tools. I'll share it in the chat. And in the very first slide, I have a link for this talk to which you can click around. Again, I'm going to share it in the chat right now so that you have access to everything.
Thank you.
I actually have not necessarily a question, but more insight I got from your talk. Is that I've been working with the search engine optimization last couple of months, and I realized that most of the things that you're supposed to do to rank high in Google searches are the same things that you tell us to do that now. So have proper image captions and use headings in the proper way and stuff like that. So. It seems like you guys at Google think that that is good with Ally, and then you should rank highest if you do that.
That is absolutely true, and that is, I know, was one of the building priorities for search team of make accessibility a priority and incentivize engineers to incorporate best practices, because then their search engine results will be better. So. Yes, it's intentional.
Oh, I figured. That's really good. Then you can show your managers that it actually you will earn money, or you will save money when you do that.
Yes, more money.
Always
do
good.
Accessibility. Rain all of the currency.
Yes, exactly. We need a gift for that. Right. So thank you so much for this talk, Alexandra. It's really, really good. So we'll take 5 minutes break now to grab a coffee or whatever you want to do. Stretch your legs, and see you around in 5 minutes, 7:15 Swedish time.